Now in Santa Cruz, California, at the University of Santa Cruz, there were two fellows, very, very important men, brilliant men, extraordinary people. Their names are John Grinder and Richard Bandler. So inside John Grinder, a relatively young man at the time, just probably in his 30s, who had come through undergraduate and grad school and a doctoral program in linguistics with some attention to psychology, some. He was steeped in the work of a man named Alfred Korzybski, men named Eugene Galanter, George Miller, Carl Pribram, people who were in the middle of the 20th century, in the late 40s, in the 50s, and the very early 60s, they were starting to grapple with this thing called systems theory. The work of Claude Shannon, extraordinarily important man. So John Grinder was right about then a newly arrived linguistics professor. Richard Bandler was a student. Richard Bandler had been a student at UC Santa Cruz for a while. He had taken a lot of psychology classes. I'm not sure, but I think he might have been a psych major. And he was kind of disappointed in the psychology and the psychotherapy of the time. John Grinder was a linguist trained in that academic specialty. And as a consequence of being in that academic specialty, linguistics, he was very familiar with the work of a great many scholars going back a really long way, back to the early 20th century, actually. They got involved in a project to discover what is it in the realms of communication work and change work of all kinds. Coaching, and that's when coaches had whistles and sneakers, okay, coaching, psychotherapy, other kinds of therapy, healing work of various kinds. What was it that let some people be naturally brilliant and other people not so much? Okay, fine, good, but not brilliant. One day they noticed what was going on. There were some people who had certain gifts, and those gifts came through their behavior, but they came from a place of being really tuned in, really aware, really available for information coming from their customer, their psychotherapy client, their student. Right? They began to try this out. They began to kind of condense it down and crystallize it and try out a variety of what later on picked up the name techniques. Techniques for connection with other people, techniques for connection and alignment with ourselves, and techniques for doing change work, for changing how our systems generate our experience. When it started to be possible or necessary to program computers to do things, people had to start to ask themselves, how do we program something? How is it done? How shall we approach it? What are the steps? What are instructions? And then gradually, of course, that began to be an analogy for human experience, that we had programming. That's that word, programming and neuro-linguistic programming. So in the work of these people, they had developed really lovely models for being able to inquire about human experience, to be able to ask in new and useful ways what's going on and maybe discuss why it was going on. What no one could answer in any kind of useful way was how. The people who were beginning to program machines and digital, or first analog computers and then digital computers, they had to know how stuff happened because they were writing the instructions. They had to understand what the software was doing, what the operating system was doing, primitive as they were. What no one could discuss usefully was how. So if I'm this person with a phobic structure, how does my brain do this? And we can say, well, you get into the presence of the thing you're really frightened about or really scared of, and then this reaction occurs and the nervous system loads up all of this fear, and then that's what happens. But the question would be how? How does that happen? So starting on the foundation of all of this extraordinary scholarship and exploration from the first half of the 20th century, there was John Grinder. That was all pretty well baked into him, just as a consequence of his education. And Richard Bandler had a certain kind of curiosity. He had had a part-time job after school, so to speak, transcribing sessions of Virginia Satir, very, very, very extraordinary family therapist, and Frederick Perls, also known as Fritz Perls, who's the co-founder of Gestalt psychology. So Richard Bandler had become fascinated with this field of psychology, not as psychology, but he wanted to know about change work. He wanted things to change. He wanted stuff to change right now. He didn't want it to have to take a long time. In the extraordinary synergy of these two people meeting, in the context of that time at UC Santa Cruz at that time, some kind of magical lightning hit, and they began to figure out all of these rather remarkable things. And the main thing that they came up with was ways of noticing how human beings weave together our experience. And what they noticed was not new, as I'll say it two ways. One's not new, one's completely new. They noticed that human beings, the programming language for our experience is pictures, sounds, feelings, smells, and tastes. The five senses that human beings have. People had been discussing that forever, right? What Bandler and Grinder and the people around them were able to do was to notice, be able to sit across from someone, to just casually talk with someone and watch the signs and signals that their body gives off that indicates when they're making pictures, when their brain is making pictures inside, when their brain is listening to sounds inside, when maybe it's loading up a little bit of the sensory impressions of smell and taste inside. The operation of our internal software, of neuro-linguistic programming, not something we're supposed to have to pay attention to. It is something that someone else who's maybe starting to work with us to revise that programming, to change that patterning so we can have more of the experience we want. It's something they want to be able to pay attention to. And that is one of the core learnings in any good NLP curriculum, is how to sit with people and notice what their brain and their body are doing that are creating the experience they're having. If it's a good experience and they want to have more, then we want to notice how they're creating that, how their brain and their body are creating that, so we can amplify it, extend it, improve it. If, is more often the case, the experience they're having is painful, limiting, frightening, it just makes us contract. We want to know how their brain is doing that. Because if we can know how it's doing that, and we can't show you that right now, if you want to see that in operation, you'll have to come to one of our free workshops here at NLP Marin. We demonstrate it. We take about 2.5, 3 hours, and we show everyone how it happens and how it works. But a really good NLP practitioner is attuned to what's going on for the person they're working with. Now, the benefit of working with someone who is trained in this is that they know a lot more about how you're generating your experience than you do. You know a lot more about your experience. It's your experience. It's really private. If you don't share it, no NLP practitioner is a mind reader. If we don't share the content of what's going on with us, the NLP person won't know what it is. But what they can see is how it's happening. And if they can see how it's happening, they can change it. We can change it. So if my brain makes a picture that I'm not consciously aware of, and that picture generates terrible feelings, I'm not going to know about the picture. I'll never be aware of it. But the practitioner sitting with me can notice the signals coming from my body that say, ah, there's a picture. That is what comes before the really terrible feeling. The really awful self-critical thought. There's this thing that happens first. Let's see if we can revise that, reprogram that step that happens first, and find out if we get a different experience for the human as a consequence of that. Neuro-linguistic programming works with the programming that generates our human experience. That programming is in a language of pictures and sounds and feelings and smells and tastes. All of our thoughts are made of pictures and sounds and feelings and smells and tastes. All of our feelings are generated by pictures or sounds or smells or tastes that generate feelings. So in the world of conventional work, conventional discussion about our experience, or the kind of sharing that people do in conventional talk therapy, which can be really useful, I think everyone is pretty aware of that. But the discussion about the content of our experience, it only, if it has a good effect of changing our experience, it changes it kind of indirectly. It changes it because we experience connection or rapport with a therapist or a coach. It changes it because we discover that we're not entirely alone in our distress or our confusion or whatever it is we've got going on that we don't want. What neurolinguistic programming adds into that kind of work that's not already present is the practitioner, the therapist, the coach, whatever that noun is given the situation. That person can observe how the experience is being generated, how it's being created. There's a picture here that creates a feeling over there. There's a soundtrack from the past. The person is not aware that their brain is listening to. And when their brain plays that soundtrack, the feelings get really worse. Right? This is something that we can never be aware of internal to ourselves. Now, in that group, as I was mentioning, there were a bunch of 19-year-olds, a bunch of 20-year-olds, a bunch of kids at the campus in those days. There was one man in that group who was a clinical psychotherapist. His name is Jonathan Rice. So let me just tick off. We have John Grinder, Richard Bandler, and now we have a man named Jonathan Rice. Jonathan was running a clinic, a psychotherapy clinic with a number of divisions in it. And Jonathan went to watch John Grinder and Richard Bandler in the very, very early days of NLP do their first public workshop. And Jonathan, as Jonathan describes it to me, Jonathan is a dear friend. He was my main teacher when I got started with this. But the way Jonathan described it, he was watching John Grinder and Richard Bandler demonstrate some of the things they had discovered. They were fixing phobias, as I understand it. It's patterning whereby we revise what the brain is doing so that we can disconnect the fear, the terror, like the awful responses that happen in people with phobic structure, which is all of us about something, yeah? John Grinder, Richard Bandler were demonstrate unwiring this right on the spot, right in the moment. Right? And Jonathan thought to himself, these two men obviously do not have training in psychology. These two men obviously do not have training in psychotherapy. But these two men can do things that I cannot do. And I'm really good. This is Jonathan talking. I'm really good at what I do. Right? But I'm watching these two men do things that I can't do. I wonder how they're doing it. So Jonathan stayed in that group. There was a very, very core group around Bandler and Grinder at UC Santa Cruz, and then there was kind of one more ring out. That's the circle that Jonathan Rice was living in and working in, because he had a day job. He was running the clinic. He was seeing patients every day. So when I came into NLP, I came in through Jonathan Rice. When I watched Jonathan Rice starting to do NLP, I was transfixed. The man had such grace, such style, and he was not doing what it is that I'd seen other NLP practitioners do, which is, it was sort of mind trippy, at least in my experience, the original forms of conventional NLP. It was kind of like mental parlor tricks at its worst. An elegant practitioner of it was very elegant. There's no question of that. But because it's so powerful and it works so well and it works so quickly when it's done right, a lot of people can take a little bit of training in it and go out in the world and start to have rather large effects. I wasn't that attracted to the style of that conventional NLP. It was sort of like, let me show you a powerful way to transform, that kind of thing. I didn't find that interesting. When I watched Jonathan sit down and do a demonstration in a class, I watched a man who connected beautifully with the person he was working with. That was some of Jonathan's natural gifts. Some of that was the toolbox in NLP that we call rapport skills. The capacity to step into another person's world respectfully and share that world and work with them in their world on their terms if we're doing change work with them. So I watched Jonathan do his just natural grace. I watched him using the NLP toolbox. And I watched him be able to notice what was going on inside of the person he was working with. How did he know what was going on inside of them? Now, that was also the NLP toolbox, and some of that was just Jonathan's natural talent. So what came out of all this, right about where I came into it in the classroom in the early 1980s, was Jonathan had taken the entire conventional NLP toolbox, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. He'd taken that whole toolbox, we'll have that over here. He had taken the whole toolbox, the whole field, his experience in psychology and the psychotherapy of the day, humanistic psychology, very kind of gentle psychology. He had taken these two worlds and just spontaneously, naturally, because of the work he was doing, he combined them. They just blended right together in Jonathan's experience, and you know what? Pretty much no place else. Because the rest of the people in the circle weren't psychologists. They were not psychotherapists. They didn't do that work every day, all day. Jonathan did. So NLP and psychology got blended together to produce the approach and the style, and essentially some of the values and some of the criteria that still underlie what we're doing here at NLP Marin now. And it's many, many, many years later now.